Bon Scott did not step onto the stage as someone favored by fate. He arrived with a voice rough enough to scrape the skin, a reckless grin, and an energy that pulled the crowd in while making them feel that something might spiral out of control at any moment. In just a few short years, Bon turned AC/DC from a loud bar band into a name that made the entire rock world take notice. But just as the lights began to shine their brightest, his life entered its most fragile chapter. Bon Scott was a paradox that could not be tamed. On stage, he was a provocateur, mocking, bawdy, turning desire, alcohol, and rebellion into a vivid, irresistible language. Away from the spotlight, he was a man constantly confronting failure, pushed to the margins, narrowly surviving accidents, and repeatedly dismissed as washed up before he ever reached the peak. And success came late, came fast, and carried a weight no one could see. And then, just as AC/DC crossed the threshold of global explosion, Bon Scott vanished suddenly on a cold night in London. His death at 33 did more than end a rising career. It left behind a trail of questions that have never been fully closed. Did he die because of alcohol, an accident, or the hidden corners of a life rock history has never fully told? And did Bon Scott truly leave AC/DC, or did he simply disappear in another way, quieter but more haunting than ever? The way Bon Scott stepped onto the stage, as if there were nothing left to hold back, was not a random choice. It was shaped very early in his life, during years when stability, safety, or a sense of belonging were never givens for him. Bon Scott was born on July 9th, 1946, in Forfar, a small town in Angus, Scotland. His birth name was Ronald Belford Scott. His father, Charles Scott, was a baker. His mother, Isabel Scott, worked in the family shop. The family lived directly above the bakery, a cramped space where daily life revolved around labor, discipline, and the necessary frugality of post-war Britain. Bon was the second son, with an older brother, Derek Scott, and his childhood was shaped more by strict household order than by indulgence. Bon's early years showed little sign of an artistic calling, and his childhood was governed by duty and by the modest yet heavy expectations of the working class. Get a proper education, work hard, stay out of trouble. When Bon was 6, the family decided to leave Scotland and emigrate to Australia, a journey with no promises attached, only a vague hope for a different life. Fremantle did not welcome Bon Scott with kindness. His thick Scottish accent made him a target for bullying, and the feeling of being cut off from the group took root early. Bon did not learn to belong by changing himself. He learned to push back. His teenage years were marked by fighting, defiance, minor offenses, and a growing air of recklessness. School could not hold him for long. Music could. He tried drums, bugle, and fife, not with dreams of performance, but as a way to release pressure and assert his existence. When Bon was sent to the Riverbank Juvenile Detention Center for delinquent behavior, it was not his first fall, but a confirmation of a trajectory already set. Living on the margins, rejecting prescribed paths, and constantly testing the boundaries placed in front of him. In that harsh environment, music stopped being a pastime. It became the only thing that kept Bon Scott from being swallowed whole. From that moment on, the road ahead, still undefined, no longer offered any real path back to safety. Music entered Bon Scott's life not with an explosion, but as a natural reflex of someone who always needed an outlet for excess energy. In 1964, at just 18, he joined the Spectres, a school band where Bon played drums and sang, neither a leader nor someone with ambitions to command the stage. Yet from the earliest shows, something was unmistakable. Bon never stood still. He didn't perform to please. He performed as if trying to escape something tightening inside him. When the Spectres merged with another group and became the Valentines, Bond's position gradually shifted from the back of the stage to the front. The Valentines gave Bon Scott something he had never known before: real success. Their catchy pop-rock songs quickly dominated Australian radio, pushed the band up the national charts, and turned Bon into a familiar face on late 1960s music television. But the cost of that success appeared early. The image built around Bon grew increasingly clean. Neat clothes, safe lyrics, every rough edge smoothed away. For someone who lived by instinct and collision, that polish felt like a shirt pulled too tight. When the band became embroiled in a drug-related arrest in 1969, one of the earliest scandals in Australian rock, Bon did not choose silence. He openly supported marijuana legalization and expressed progressive views on LGBT rights, positions far ahead of their time, and ones that only widened the rift between him and the band's commercial direction. In 1970, the Valentines disbanded, leaving Bon with the sensation of having tasted the light and being burned by it. Bon left Sydney, moved to Adelaide, and entered fraternity with a completely different mindset. No radio formulas, no hit-making strategies. The band pursued progressive rock infused with psychedelic and blues influences. Long, complex compositions that demanded commitment rather than crowd-pleasing. Their two albums, Livestock and Flaming Gala, failed to ignite public excitement, but they gave Bon the space to discover his true voice: raw, thick, and unmasked. The subsequent UK tour was a hard collision with reality. Small venues, indifferent audiences, and dwindling money. Fraternity rebranded as Fang in an attempt at rebirth, but no miracle followed. What remained was a Bon Scott who had fully shed his pop exterior, who had learned to stand before a microphone as himself, rougher, more resolute, and ready to walk a narrower path. A one less forgiving, but faithful to an instinct that could never be tamed. The silence after the fraternity years did not last long, but what awaited Bon Scott was not a new opportunity. In 1974, on a road in Adelaide, a motorcycle accident struck with such speed and brutality that there was no time to react. Bon was thrown violently, suffered severe injuries, and fell into a coma that lasted 3 days. When he woke up, his body was no longer the body of a touring singer. Broken teeth, a disfigured face, lingering pain, and a cold verdict from doctors that returning to the stage was a distant prospect at best. For someone who had only just found his true voice, the crash did more than damage his body. It struck directly at his sense of identity. Bon was forced to confront the possibility of losing the one thing that had ever given him a place in the world. Rehearsals and late-night shows were replaced by slow recovery and the uneasy, pitying looks of those who once stood beside him. At times, Bon was treated as a man who had reached the end of his musical road, not because he lacked talent, but because he no longer seemed physically able to continue. The months after the accident became a string of nameless jobs, painting houses, mowing lawns, driving for hire just to get by. Music didn't disappear, but it was pushed into a corner, existing more as memory than reality. Son, it was in this context that Bon accepted work as a roadie for a young band playing raw, loud rock in bar rooms, AC/DC. He carried amplifiers, drove the van, stood behind the stage, watching faces younger and hungrier than his own. For Bon, it was the lowest position he had ever reached. Close enough to music to remember it, far enough away to remain unnamed. And in that quiet, a low-burning tension took shape between accepting that his time was over and the sense that whatever lived inside him was not yet exhausted. Ironically, it was this position on the margins that opened a door Bon Scott had never anticipated. In October 1974, While working as a roadie for AC/DC, he watched a band full of energy but missing a crucial piece. Dave Evans had a high, bright voice suited to glam rock, but the sound AC/DC was forging on stage was drifting further and further away from that image. When Evans left, Bon wasn't called in as a star candidate, only as a familiar face to try out, almost as a formality. Yet the moment Bon opened his mouth during a jam session, the band's axis shifted completely. Gone was any trace of polish. A C/DC immediately snapped into a kind of rock that was raw, dirty, soaked in sweat and instinct. Bon didn't simply step into the role of lead singer, he wrote lyrics, shaped the vocal attitude, and transformed stories of street life, alcohol, desire, and labor into the band's own language. From that point on, AC/DC was no longer young and easy to like, but provocative, defiant, and hard to control. In 1975, the Australian release of High Voltage landed like a localized explosion. Songs such as It's a Long Way to the Top, If You Wanna Rock and Roll, carried both Scottish bagpipes and a sharp, bitter irony, mirroring the road Bon himself had traveled. The album needed no major promotional campaign, yet it quickly gained traction at home, laying the groundwork for AC/DC to become an unavoidable name in Australia. That same year, TNT pushed everything even further. Stripped-down riffs, bold lyrics, and a Bon Scott increasingly confident as an unfiltered storyteller. His chemistry with the young brothers was not always smooth. Bon constantly pulled the lyrics toward raw, lived reality, while the band struggled to balance provocation with long-term survival. It was precisely that tension that generated AC/DC's distinctive energy, unpolished, unapologetic, and never entirely safe for anyone standing too close. From domestic momentum, AC/DC stepped beyond national borders with a move that was both bold and deeply risky. The international edition of High Voltage in 1976 was not simply an overseas reissue of the Australian album. It was a deliberate reconstruction. The track list was curated, the pacing tightened, and Bon Scott began writing lyrics with a clearer awareness of a global audience. His voice was no longer a wild outburst, but a controlled weapon, satirical, confrontational, yet sharp enough to cut through cultural barriers. The album helped the band gain a foothold in Europe, sparking equal parts curiosity and skepticism, an Australian group daring to bring stripped-down rock to stages accustomed to polish. That same year, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap arrived like a slap in the face of convention. Its suggestive lyrics, black humor, and cast of dirty work characters quickly led American labels to turn their backs. The rejection was more than a business decision. It reflected fear of a Bon Scott, increasingly unwilling to soften himself. Instead of adjusting, Bon pushed harder on street language, turning songs into half-joking, half-true vignettes about violence, desire, and backroom deals. In Europe and Australia, the album still found listeners, nurturing a fan base that felt aligned with the industry's cast-offs. By Let There Be Rock in 1977, caution turned into open confrontation. The sound grew harsher, faster, almost unforgiving. Bon wrote as if responding directly to everything the band had endured: doubt, rejection, and accusations of being too raw. The album was not only an artistic manifesto, but also a physical and psychological trial, driving Bon into a punishing touring cycle where he had to serve as both spiritual leader and proof that this kind of rock did not need approval to survive. After repeated collisions with markets and prejudice, Powerage in 1978 emerged as the most stripped-down record of Bon Scott's mental state. The music shed all ornamentation. The lyrics stopped chasing shock for its own sake and went straight for the feeling of being pinned. People living on the margins, petty hustles, debts that never get paid. At release, the album made little noise commercially. Only years later did critics return to Powerage as one of the rare works balancing riff weight with lived language, where Bon wrote with a cool sharpness, enough to hurt without posturing. For him, it was the most honest voice he had. Black humor not for amusement, but for self-defense. The pressure did not ease when AC/DC entered the studio for Highway to Hell in 1979. Working for the first time with a producer focused on the U.S. market, the band was placed in a tighter framework, and Bon had to hone lyrics that were direct yet radio-proof. The result was an album both explosive and suffocating, lines sharp as razors, laughing in the face of the touring road's own hazards. When the album cracked the Billboard Top 20 and became AC/DC's ticket into the mainstream, success arrived alongside a relentless global tour schedule. Night after night, Bon stood before tens of thousands, shouting street tales as if confessing in a public courtroom. Fame opened doors, but it also tightened the cycle. Writing more directly and at greater speed, Bon poured everything into each show, compensating with alcohol to sustain a life without pause. The black humor grew sharper, laughter rang out through exhaustion, and the body paid the price for an unforgiving schedule. Under the blazing lights of the Highway to Hell tour, Bon Scott stood at the peak of his career, carrying an invisible burden, where every song was a step forward, and every night on stage was another act of self-erosion. Amid an ever-tightening touring cycle and the invisible pressure that success brings, Bon Scott's emotional life never followed the logic of a rising star. Before the name AC/DC became inseparable from him, before fraternity, before the endless miles on the road, Bon had shared a deep attachment with Maria Van Vlimen. Their story began in the mid-1960s, when he was still a young musician playing youth clubs around Perth. Bon met Maria around 1965, during the period when the Spectors were transforming into the Valentines. Maria was very young then, from a well-to-do family, raised in a world of discipline and social propriety entirely at odds with Bon, a musician caught between rebellious instinct and a hunger for recognition. That difference didn't immediately create distance. It became a source of attraction. Maria wasn't just a girlfriend. She was present around the band, helped organize the fan club, and followed closely as Bon began to draw attention at the band's earliest shows. The relationship never led to marriage. What they shared was a span of several years, long enough to leave a mark on how Bon understood intimacy and commitment. Around Maria, Bon tried to live more properly, dressing neatly, limiting his drinking when visiting her family, even taking part in social routines his friends considered foreign to him. At the same time, his musical path veered sharply in a direction Maria and her family could not accept. Long absences, relentless nights on stage, and an increasingly provocative image for the Valentines. The tension didn't explode into scandal. It accumulated quietly, through Bon's absences, the band's unspoken rules, and the feeling of being pulled in two irreconcilable directions. When the Valentines broke up in 1970 and Bon left Perth for Adelaide to join fraternity, then his relationship with Maria closed in silence. There was no public breakup announcement, just two paths drifting apart. One toward the stable life Maria had been taught to protect, the other toward music growing too fierce for Bon to restrain. With the end of his bond with Maria Van Vlimen, Bon Scott entered a completely different living space, Adelaide in the early 1970s, where fraternity gave him, for the first time, the feeling of making music by pure instinct. It was in this context, around 1971, that Bon met Irene Thornton, a local secretary, calm and practical, far removed from the chaotic stage world he was entering. Irene's presence carried no sense of admiration or being swept up in fame. She saw Bon as a man who needed anchoring, and at that moment, Bon himself was searching for proof that he could live on the right path. They came together quickly, almost by reflex. In January 1972, Bon and Irene married. There was no lavish wedding, no lights, no noisy circle of music industry friends. Their early married life resembled the stability Bon had once tried and failed to achieve with Maria. A small house, dinners at regular hours, and the sense of building something more durable than fleeting gigs. Irene believed Bon's music would eventually find its place. Bon believed this love could keep him from his familiar extremes. That rhythm began to fracture as fraternity plunged into extended tours, especially the 1973 trip to England. Ambition exceeded reality. The tour failed, money ran out, and Bon returned home carrying not only exhaustion, but bitterness, abandoned by the industry into which he had poured everything. Alcohol returned with greater frequency, but arguments crept into a space built for calm. Irene didn't oppose the music, but she bore the consequences of nights when Bon could no longer control himself. The strain peaked in 1973 as Bon drifted further from domestic life, and Irene gradually realized that the role of holding Bon together was more than someone outside that world could sustain. With no children to bind them and no compromises strong enough to repair the cracks, they separated in a long, quiet unraveling. By 1974, the marriage officially ended in divorce, almost coinciding with the period when Bon suffered his motorcycle accident and hit bottom both physically and mentally. For Bon Scott, Irene Thornton was not merely his only wife on paper. She represented his most serious attempt to step away from a self-destructive trajectory. The collapse of that marriage left a deep mark, quiet, without scandal, but enough to reinforce a hard truth. The path he chose, however blazing it became, always demanded losses that could not be undone. After the collapse of his marriage to Irene Thornton, Bon Scott's emotional life shifted into an entirely different mode. He was no longer searching for stability, nor did he cling to the illusion that love could pull him out of the trajectory music had already set. In the late 1970s in London, Bon lived with Anna Baba, a reserved Japanese woman who stood outside the Western entertainment world and did not enter his life as a loud admirer. And Anna's presence functioned as a temporary refuge. Their shared apartment was not a place for parties, but somewhere Bon could return after tours, to catch up on sleep, to reread scraps of lyric notes scattered through his jacket pockets. There was no marriage license, no children, no ambition of building a future. The relationship existed as a quiet parallel companionship during the last period in which Bon still maintained a relatively stable rhythm of life. Alongside Anna, the past never fully released its hold on him. Silver Smith, an Australian former girlfriend, continued to appear intermittently in Bon's life during his time in London. Silver belonged to a different world, one where the boundaries between music, partying, and intoxicants were blurred. There is no evidence of a secret family or any biological children. What existed instead were overlapping emotional ties, reflecting a Bon Scott who no longer tried to organize his private life according to any accepted template. What matters is that Bon did not enter his final weeks in a state of surrender. After the Highway to Hell tour wrapped up in early 1980, he returned to London with the mindset of someone still working. Meetings with the young brothers were regular, new riff ideas were tested, song structures sketched out. Bon carried notebooks and small scraps of paper, jotting down lines, rhymes, sometimes just a spoken rhythm that felt right. At times, he wasn't at the microphone, but behind the drum kit during rehearsals, keeping time and listening to the whole, much as he had done before becoming a frontman. This presence placed Bon in the embryonic phase of the next album. Not finished songs, not complete lyrics, but a creative atmosphere taking shape. He drank heavily, yes, but not as an escape from work. It was the familiar rhythm of life he had long maintained alongside his own private discipline of making music. Between the London apartment, rehearsal rooms, and wandering nights, Bon Scott still behaved like a man with work left to do. He did not see Highway to Hell as a final stop, nor did he believe he had finished telling AC/DC's story. On the night of February 18, 1980, Bon Scott was seen for the last time at a nightclub in Camden, North London. It was an ordinary evening, like hundreds he had lived before. Drinking, listening to music, talking, and disappearing into the crowd. But after that night, Bon never came back. Now, according to the official account, Bon planned to meet his former girlfriend, Silver Smith, but when she was unable to come, she asked her friend Alistair Kinnear to take Bon out to see a band at the Music Machine nightclub. They drank, talked, and left around midnight. On the way back, Bon fell asleep in the car. Unable to wake him, Kinnear parked his Renault 5 outside his flat in East Dulwich, covered Bon with a blanket, and left him in the car with a note saying that if he woke up, he should come upstairs. The next morning, Bon Scott was found dead, curled in the back seat, his mouth filled with vomit, his neck twisted, his dental plate dislodged. According to the coroner's report, he died from asphyxiation due to vomiting in a state of acute alcohol poisoning, a familiar phrase in rock history. Death by misadventure. But the death immediately sparked controversy. Colin Burgess, AC/DC's original drummer, who was at the nightclub that night, insisted Bon was completely sober when he left. "I can swear it. He wasn't drunk. Not at all." Other witnesses said Bon was speaking clearly and walking normally. So what happened in just a few hours? Much of the contradiction began to center on the name Alistair Kinnear. Only days after Bon's death, Kinnear disappeared. No one could reach him. His apartment was reportedly broken into and ransacked. Some journalists began to suspect that Kinnear was a fabricated name or a composite identity for those who had been with Bon that night, possibly including drug dealers. Because alongside alcohol, there was something else that night: heroin. Bon had been involved with heroin in the past. Author Jesse Fink in Bon, The Last Highway, argues that Bon had overdosed twice before, and that this death was the third, this time irreversible. People linked to that night, from Silver Smith to musician Peter Parrott, were all alleged to have connections to heroin. Fink concluded, "I don't believe alcohol alone could have killed Bon Scott." Although the toxicology report recorded only alcohol and detected no drugs, the questions remain. Why did the position of the body differ from the description given by the last person to see him alive? Why would someone as accustomed to heavy drinking as Bon suffocate after 7 whiskeys? And why did everyone connected to that night remain shadowy, unwilling to step forward? Yet the most painful question belonged to his family. Bon's mother, when she received a phone call from a band member, initially thought her son was calling to wish her a happy birthday. Instead, she was told that her son was dead, alone, in a cold car, half a world away. A C/DC was thrown into turmoil. They believed the band would dissolve. No one wanted to continue without Bon, but it was the Scott family who encouraged them. Bon would never want you to stop, and so they turned to Brian Johnson, whom Bon himself had once praised after seeing him perform with the band Geordie. Johnson became the replacement, but he always refused to sing "It's a Long Way to the Top," the song that only Bon had the right to sing. Bon Scott's death sent shockwaves through the rock world. But what hurts more is the manner of his passing. quiet, solitary, and never fully explained. At the very moment he stood at the peak, as the band was preparing to write Back in Black, that screaming voice was suddenly extinguished, leaving behind a void that no one, not even those who survived him, has ever been able to fill. The gap surrounding that final night quickly gave rise to a debate that would stretch across decades, centered on the album released immediately afterward. AC/DC's position has always been consistent. Bon Scott left no lyrics behind, wrote no melodies, and had no direct involvement in the songs that appeared on Back in Black. For the band, this stance served two purposes at once: protecting Brian Johnson's integrity as the new singer, and preserving respect for Bon as a chapter that had closed, not something to be reopened for credit disputes or emotional exploitation. On paper, the story was clean and simple, and they held to it for years. But beneath the official record, those who worked in the studio recall a quieter, less dramatic version, one built from small details. Before Brian Johnson entered the picture, there were already riffs, grooves, and rhythmic frameworks being tested over and over again. Rehearsal tapes existed, capturing the rough skeletons of early ideas. Bon was present in that initial phase, not as someone finishing songs, but as part of the creative atmosphere itself, listening, offering feedback, sometimes sitting behind the drum kit to hold time while the young brothers searched for direction. No one has ever produced evidence that Bon wrote complete lyrics or left behind notebook pages that were used verbatim. What remains instead is the trace of his presence, the way energy in the rehearsal room was pushed higher, and the way words were weighed to hit right without polish. The truth sits between two extremes. There is no authorship credit that bears Bon's name, yet it is equally hard to deny the spiritual influence of someone who departed just as the songwriting machinery had begun to turn. When Back in Black was released, the black cover needed no explanation. The tolling church bell was not a gimmick, but a deliberate slowing of breath to remember someone who had once electrified the room. The album quickly moved beyond memorial, becoming one of the best-selling records in rock history and propelling AC/DC to a level few bands ever reach. That success did not erase Bon Scott. It placed him on a different plane of collective memory, the one who cleared the path, then vanished at the exact moment the fire burned brightest. Years later, when Bon's name was spoken at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2003, the conversation no longer revolved around technical disputes. He was remembered as one of the most influential frontmen in rock, a lyricist who spoke in street language, yet touched a universal unease. In Fremantle, Where Bon Now Rests, flowers and handwritten notes from all over the world continue to appear, not to solve the mystery of the last night, but to affirm something simpler. Bon Scott did not disappear with an unanswered question. He remains in music raw enough to reject perfection, and honest enough for listeners to recognize themselves within it. Bon Scott's legacy is not measured by how long he lived, but by the intensity with which he lived. In an industry that constantly manufactures icons, Bon never tried to become one. He was never polished. He had no image strategy. He never posed as a legend. He was simply himself, a man rejected by school, by the military, by society, and at times by his own reflection. The only thing Bon did was stand up, grab the microphone, and scream so he would not disappear. Strangely, that scream was never out of place. It cut through street stories, rough riffs, sweat-soaked nights to reach people who had never met him. In just 5 short years with AC/DC, Bon helped the band step out of the shadow of a local phenomenon and into global light. He didn't just sing. He shaped attitude, bent the language of rock toward unfiltered truth. Where black humor stood beside exhaustion, where instinct went uncensored. It was rock that was still dirty, still rough, still alive, before it was packaged into formula. Bond's death was not a sudden slip. It was the consequence of a life he never hid. If time had to be traded for living honestly, Bond chose to pay the price. He didn't live long, but he lived fiercely enough to be unforgettable. Rock and roll didn't die with him. It kept sounding, and every time the music rises, Bond screams once more in order to exist. Bon Scott lived like a flame, brilliant, reckless, never retreating. If you've ever been swept up by a riff from Let There Be Rock, ever shouted along to Highway to Hell, ever seen yourself in that fractured scream, leave a comment saying, "Love Scott," to remember an artist who refused to be silent. Share this story with anyone who loves rock with their heart, not with a formula. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, so that every time the music starts, Bon Scott gets to live once more. Right here among us,